Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls formally presented their final report on Monday, in which they found that the tragic violence against Indigenous women and girls amounts to genocide.
Statistics Canada came out with a new report last week that should make a profound difference in Canadian public policy. But I'm guessing it won't, because the conclusions in the Stats Can report are at odds with the woke progressive narrative on why there are missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. You remember, the Liberal government, one of the first things that they announced when they came into power in 2015 was they were going to have a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The narrative at that point was that white society, systemic discrimination within the justice system was minimizing how bad this situation was. There were hundreds of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and yet no one seemed to care. The problem was obviously white society, and no one cared. That was the Liberal narrative. They ran on that narrative in the election in 2015. And so they set up this national inquiry that spent $54 million and took 3 years to come to the conclusion that it was genocide. You remember that. 2019, when the survey came out, the study came out, we were all accused of having committed genocide against Indigenous women and girls.
And our focus, as I said, we accept those findings. We accept the finding that this was genocide. And we will move forward to end this ongoing national tragedy.
Even the Prime Minister agreed it was genocide. And the chairman of the commission said it was deliberate. It was gender-based. It was racist. The whole problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was that there was systemic discrimination in Canada and systemic discrimination among the police and the justice system. No one cared. The police didn't investigate. Well, the numbers are wrong. The National Inquiry's numbers were wrong. I'd say they're phony, but I don't have evidence that they were concocted. What they said was that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were not investigated. Their disappearances and murders were not investigated. Police didn't care. The justice system didn't send people away. Well, the new Stats Can study that came out last week says 86% of missing and murdered Indigenous women were killed by other Indigenous people, mostly Indigenous men, occasionally another Indigenous woman. So mostly missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are killed by Indigenous men. Does that make it less tragic that they're dead? No, of course not. It is also no excuse for not investigating. But as the RCMP statistics show, they do investigate. They lay charges in 87% of the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it's 90% among non-Indigenous women and girls. That's a statistical variance that really isn't all that significant. But let's go at that again. 86% of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are killed by other Indigenous people. That means it's not genocide. And it means that all of the fancy solutions that the Liberals have come up with, all of the fancy solutions that the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls came up with, are destined to fail because they try to solve the wrong problem. The problem is not inherent discrimination in the system. The problem is not white indifference, white privilege, white racism against Indigenous women and girls. The problem is violence within Indigenous communities. Now, we can talk forever about why that might be and how white society may have contributed to the poverty, the unemployment, the addictions, all of the things that have led to this situation where Indigenous men frequently are responsible for the murders of Indigenous women and girls. But what we can't say is, let's go after white society. Let's go after white privilege. That's what's going to solve the problem, because it's not going to solve the problem. The other thing that the StatsCan study did find was that the murderers of Indigenous women and girls do get sentences that are about 3 years lighter than the murderers of non-Indigenous women and girls. So you say, oh, see, there's proof that there's racism in the system. Well, yeah, it's kind of proof of racism, but not the kind of racism you're thinking about. Since 1999, a Supreme Court ruling called Gladue has made it necessary for judges to discount the sentences of Indigenous criminals because of the general difficulty of growing up Indigenous. Indigenous murderers get shorter sentences than non-Indigenous murderers. The murderers who are Indigenous themselves get shorter sentences than murderers who are not Indigenous. And what that has led to is this indirect consequence that when women are murdered in Indigenous communities, their murderers get lighter sentences because they're also Indigenous. That's the racism. That's the effect of the racism. The racism has discounted the lives of Indigenous women and girls. And that has led, perhaps, to more murders of Indigenous women and girls. It's the woke progressivism that's the problem, not white society. Follow us on YouTube and on all the major social media platforms. For Post Media, I'm Lauren Gunter.